Chapter 23. The manservant William came and set the chairs for the maids, and presently they filed in. First Christina's maid, then the cook, then the housemaid, then William, and then the coachman. I sat opposite them, and watched their faces as Theobald read a chapter from the Bible. They were nice people, but more absolute vacancy I never saw upon the countenances of human beings. Theobald began by reading a few verses from the Old Testament, according to some system of his own. On this occasion the passage came from the 15th chapter of Numbers. It had no particular bearing that I could see upon anything which was going on just then, but the spirit which breathed throughout the whole seemed to me to be so like that of Theobald himself, that I could understand better after hearing it, how he came to think as he thought, and act as he acted. The verses are as follows: "But the soul that doeth aught presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and hath broken his commandments, that soul shall be utterly cut off, his iniquity shall be upon him." And while the children of Israel were in the wilderness they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron, and unto all the congregation. And they put him in ward because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, "The man shall be surely put to death, all the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp." And all the congregation brought him without the camp, and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord commanded Moses. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes. That ye may remember and do all my commandments and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God which brought you out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. I am the Lord your God." My thoughts wandered while Theobald was reading the above, and reverted to a little matter which I had observed in the course of the afternoon. It happened that some years previously, a swarm of bees had taken up their abode in the roof of the house under the slates, and had multiplied so that the drawing-room was a good deal frequented by these bees during the summer, when the windows were open. The drawing-room paper was of a pattern which consisted of bunches of red and white roses, and I saw several bees at different times fly up to these bunches and try them, under the impression that they were real flowers. Having tried one bunch, they tried the next, and the next, and the next, till they reached the one that was nearest the ceiling. Then they went down bunch by bunch as they had ascended, till they were stopped by the back of the sofa. On this they ascended bunch by bunch to the ceiling again, and so on till I was tired of watching them. As I thought of the family prayers being repeated night and morning, week by week, month by month, and year by year, I could nor help thinking how like it was to the way in which the bees went up the wall and down the wall, bunch by bunch, without ever suspecting that so many of the associated ideas could be present, and yet the main idea be wanting hopelessly, and forever. When Theobald had finished reading we all knelt down and the Carlo Dolci and the Sassoferrato looked down upon a sea of upturned backs, as we buried our faces in our chairs. I noted that Theobald prayed that we might be made truly honest and conscientious in all our dealings, and smiled at the introduction of the truly. Then my thoughts ran back to the bees and I reflected that after all it was perhaps as well at any rate for Theobald that our prayers were seldom marked by any very encouraging degree of response, for if I had thought there was the slightest chance of my being heard I should have prayed that someone might ere long treat him as he had treated Ernest. Then my thoughts wandered on to those calculations which people make about waste of time and how much one can get done if one gives 10 minutes a day to it. And I was thinking what improper suggestion I could make in connection with this and the time spent on family prayers which should at the same time be just tolerable, when I heard Theobald beginning the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and in a few seconds the ceremony was over, and the servants filed out again as they had filed in. As soon as they had left the drawing room, Christina, who was a little ashamed of the transaction to which I had been a witness, imprudently returned to it, and began to justify it, saying that it cut her to the heart, and that it cut Theobald to the heart and a good deal more, but that it was the only thing to be done. I received this as coldly as I decently could, and by my silence during the rest of the evening showed that I disapproved of what I had seen. Next day I was to go back to London, but before I went I said I should like to take some new laid eggs back with me, so Theobald took me to the house of a labourer in the village who lived a stone's throw from the rectory as being likely to supply me with them. Ernest, for some reason or other, was allowed to come too. I think the hens had begun to sit, but at any rate eggs were scarce, and the cottager's wife could not find me more than 7 or 8, which we proceeded to wrap up in separate pieces of paper so that I might take them to town safely. This operation was carried on upon the ground in front of the cottage door, and while we were in the midst of it the cottager's little boy, a lad much about Ernest's age, trod upon one of the eggs that was wrapped up in paper and broke it. "There now, Jack," said his mother, "see what you've done, you've broken a nice egg and cost me a penny. Here, Emma," she added, calling her daughter, "take the child away, there's a dear." Emma came at once, and walked off with the youngster, taking him out of harm's way. "Papa," said Ernest, after we had left the house, "why didn't Mrs. Heaton whip Jack when he trod on the egg?" I was spiteful enough to give Theobald a grim smile which said as plainly as words could have done that I thought Ernest had hit him rather hard. Theobald coloured and looked angry. "I dare say," he said quickly, "that his mother will whip him now that we are gone." I was not going to have this and said I did not believe it, and so the matter dropped, but Theobald did not forget it and my visits to Battersby were henceforth less frequent. On our return to the house we found the postman had arrived and had brought a letter appointing Theobald to a rural deanery which had lately fallen vacant by the death of one of the neighbouring clergy who had held the office for many years. The bishop wrote to Theobald most warmly, and assured him that he valued him as among the most hard-working and devoted of his parochial clergy. Christina of course was delighted, and gave me to understand that it was only an installment of the much higher dignities which were in store for Theobald when his merits were more widely known. I did not then foresee how closely my godson's life and mine were in after years to be bound up together. If I had, I should doubtless have looked upon him with different eyes and noted much to which I paid no attention at the time. As it was, I was glad to get away from him, for I could do nothing for him, or chose to say that I could not, and the sight of so much suffering was painful to me. A man should not only have his own way as far as possible, but he should only consort with things that are getting their own way so far that they are at any rate comfortable. Unless for short times under exceptional circumstances, he should not even see things that have been stunted or starved, much less should he eat meat that has been vexed by having been overdriven or underfed, or afflicted with any disease, nor should he touch vegetables that have not been well grown. For all these things cross a man, whatever a man comes in contact with in any way forms a cross with him which will leave him better or worse, and the better things he is crossed with the more likely he is to live long and happily. All things must be crossed a little or they would cease to live, but holy things, such for example as Giovanni Bellini's saints, have been crossed with nothing but what is good of its kind. Chapter 24. The storm which I have described in the previous chapter was a sample of those that occurred daily for many years. No matter how clear the sky, it was always liable to cloud over now in one quarter now in another, and the thunder and lightning were upon the young people before they knew where they were. "And then, you know," said Ernest to me, when I asked him not long since to give me more of his childish reminiscences for the benefit of my story, "we used to learn Mrs. Barbauld's hymns. They were in prose, and there was one about the lion which began, 'Come, and I will show you what is strong. The lion is strong, when he raiseth himself from his lair, when he shaketh his mane, when the voice of his roaring is heard the cattle of the field fly, and the beasts of the desert hide themselves, for he is very terrible.' I used to say this to Joey and Charlotte about my father himself when I got a little older, but they were always didactic, and said it was naughty of me. One great reason why clergymen's households are generally unhappy is because the clergyman is so much at home or close about the house. The doctor is out visiting patients half his time, the lawyer and the merchant have offices away from home, but the clergyman has no official place of business which shall ensure his being away from home for many hours together at stated times. Our great days were when my father went for a day's shopping to Gildenham. We were some miles from this place, and commissions used to accumulate on my father's list till he would make a day of it and go and do the lot. As soon as his back was turned the air felt lighter, as soon as the hall door opened to let him in again, the law with its all-reaching touch not, taste not, handle not was upon us again. The worst of it was that I could never trust Joey and Charlotte. They would go a good way with me and then turn back, or even the whole way, and then their consciences would compel them to tell Papa and Mama. They liked running with the hare up to a certain point, but their instinct was towards the hounds. It seems to me, he continued, that the family is a survival of the principle which is more logically embodied in the compound animal, and the compound animal is a form of life which has been found incompatible with high development. I would do with the family among mankind what nature has done with the compound animal, and confine it to the lower and less progressive races. Certainly there is no inherent love for the family system on the part of nature herself. Poll the forms of life and you will find it in a ridiculously small minority. The fishes know it not, and they get along quite nicely. The ants and the bees, who far outnumber man, sting their fathers to death as a matter of course, and are given to the atrocious mutilation of 9/10 of the offspring committed to their charge, yet where shall we find communities more universally respected? Take the cuckoo again, is there any bird which we like better? I saw he was running off from his own reminiscences and tried to bring him back to them, but it was no use. What a fool, he said, a man is to remember anything that happened more than a week ago unless it was pleasant, or unless he wants to make some use of it. Sensible people get the greater part of their own dying done during their own lifetime. A man at 35 should no more regret not having had a happier childhood than he should regret not having been born a prince of the blood. He might be happier if he had been more fortunate in childhood, but, for aught he knows, if he had, something else might have happened which might have killed him long ago. If I had to be born again I would be born at Battersby of the same father and mother as before, and I would not alter anything that has ever happened to me. The most amusing incident that I can remember about his childhood was that when he was about 7 years old he told me he was going to have a natural child. I asked him his reasons for thinking this, and he explained that Papa and Mama had always told him that nobody had children till they were married, and as long as he had believed this of course he had had no idea of having a child, till he was grown up. But not long since he had been reading Mrs. Markham's History of England and had come upon the words John of Gaunt had several natural children. He had therefore asked his governess what a natural child was. Were not all children natural? Oh, my dear, said she, a natural child is a child a person has before he is married. On this it seemed to follow logically that if John of Gaunt had had children before he was married, he, Ernest Pontifex, might have them also, and he would be obliged to me if I would tell him what he had better do under the circumstances. I inquired how long ago he had made this discovery. He said about a fortnight, and he did not know where to look for the child, for it might come at any moment. You know, he said, babies come so suddenly, one goes to bed one night and next morning there is a baby. Why, it might die of cold if we are not on the lookout for it. I hope it will be a boy. And you have told your governess about this? Yes, but she puts me off and does not help me. She says it will not come for many years, and she hopes not then. Are you quite sure that you have not made any mistake in all this? Oh, no, because Mrs. Byrne, you know, called here a few days ago, and I was sent for to be looked at. And Mama held me out at arm's length and said, is he Mr. Pontifex's child, Mrs. Byrne, or is he mine? Of course, she couldn't have said this if Papa had not had some of the children himself. I did think the gentleman had all the boys and the lady all the girls, but it can't be like this, or else Mama would not have asked Mrs. Byrne to guess. But then Mrs. Byrne said, "Oh, he's Mr. Pontifex's child of course," and I didn't quite know what she meant by saying of course. It seemed as though I was right in thinking that the husband has all the boys and the wife all the girls. I wish you would explain to me all about it. This I could hardly do, so I changed the conversation, after reassuring him as best I could. Chapter 25. 3 or 4 years after the birth of her daughter, Christina had had one more child. She had never been strong since she married, and had a presentiment that she should not survive this last confinement. She accordingly wrote the following letter, which was to be given, as she endorsed upon it, to her sons when Ernest was 16 years old. It reached him on his mother's death many years later, for it was the baby who died now, and not Christina. It was found among papers which she had repeatedly and carefully arranged, with the seal already broken. This, I am afraid, shows that Christina had read it and thought it too creditable to be destroyed when the occasion that had called it forth had gone by. It is as follows: Battersby, March 15, 1841. My two dear boys, when this is put into your hands, will you try to bring to mind the mother whom you lost in your childhood, and whom, I fear, you will almost have forgotten. You, Ernest, will remember her best, for you are past 5 years old, and the many, many times that she has taught you your prayers and hymns and psalms and told you stories, and our happy Sunday evenings will not quite have passed from your mind, and you, Joey, though only 4, will perhaps recollect some of these things. My dear, dear boys, for the sake of that mother who loved you very dearly, and for the sake of your own happiness for ever and ever, attend to and try to remember, and from time to time read over again the last words she can never speak to you. When I think about leaving you all, 2 things press heavily upon me. 1, your father's sorrow, for you, my darlings, after missing me a little while, will soon forget your loss. The other, the everlasting welfare of my children. I know how long and deep the former will be, and I know that he will look to his children to be almost his only earthly comfort. You know, for I am certain that it will have been so, how he has devoted his life to you and taught you and labored to lead you to all that is right and good. Oh, then, be sure that you are his comforts. Let him find you obedient, affectionate and attentive to his wishes, upright, self-denying and diligent. Let him never blush for or grieve over the sins and follies of those who owe him such a debt of gratitude, and whose first duty it is to study his happiness. You have both of you a name which must not be disgraced, a father and a grandfather of whom to show yourselves worthy. Your respectability and well-doing in life rest mainly with yourselves, but far, far beyond earthly respectability and well-doing, and compared with which they are as nothing. Your eternal happiness rests with yourselves. You know your duty, but snares and temptations from without beset you, and the nearer you approach to manhood the more strongly will you feel this. With God's help, with God's word, and with humble hearts you will stand in spite of everything, but should you leave off seeking in earnest for the first, and applying to the second, should you learn to trust in yourselves, or to the advice and example of too many around you, you must fall. Oh, let God be true and every man a liar. He says you cannot serve him and mammon. He says that straight is the gate that leads to eternal life. Many there are who seek to widen it. They will tell you that such and such self-indulgences are but venial offenses, that this and that worldly compliance is excusable and even necessary. The thing cannot be, for in 100 places he tells you so. Look to your Bibles and seek there whether such counsel is true, and if not, oh, halt not between 2 opinions. If God is the Lord, follow him, only be strong and of a good courage, and he will never leave you nor forsake you. Remember, there is not in the Bible one law for the rich, and one for the poor, one for the educated and one for the ignorant. To all there is but one thing needful. All are to be living to God and their fellow creatures, and not to themselves. All must seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, must deny themselves, be pure and chaste and charitable in the fullest and widest sense, all, forgetting those things that are behind, must press forward towards the mark, for the prize of the high calling of God. And now I will add but two things more. Be true through life to each other, love as only brothers should do, strengthen, warn, encourage one another, and let who will be against you, let each feel that in his brother he has a firm and faithful friend who will be so to the end, and, oh! Be kind and watchful over your dear sister. Without mother or sisters she will doubly need her brother's love and tenderness and confidence. I am certain she will seek them, and will love you and try to make you happy. Be sure then that you do not fail her, and remember, that were she to lose her father and remain unmarried, she would doubly need protectors. To you, then, I especially commend her. Oh! My three darling children, be true to each other, your father, and your God. May He guide and bless you, and grant that in a better and happier world I and mine may meet again. Your most affectionate mother, Christina Pontifex. From inquiries I have made, I have satisfied myself that most mothers write letters like this shortly before their confinements, and that 50% keep them afterwards, as Christina did. Chapter 26. The foregoing letter shows how much greater was Christina's anxiety for the eternal than for the temporal welfare of her sons. One would have thought she had sowed enough of such religious wild oats by this time, but she had plenty still to sow. To me it seems that those who are happy in this world are better and more lovable people than those who are not, and that thus in the event of a resurrection and day of judgment, they will be the most likely to be deemed worthy of a heavenly mansion. Perhaps a dim unconscious perception of this was the reason why Christina was so anxious for Theobald's earthly happiness, or was it merely due to a conviction that his eternal welfare was so much a matter of course, that it only remained to secure his earthly happiness? He was to find his sons obedient, affectionate, attentive to his wishes, self-denying and diligent, a goodly string forsooth of all the virtues most convenient to parents. He was never to have to blush for the follies of those who owed him such a debt of gratitude, and whose first duty it was to study his happiness. How like maternal solicitude is this! Solicitude for the most part lest the offspring should come to have wishes and feelings of its own, which may occasion many difficulties, fancied or real. It is this that is at the bottom of the whole mischief. But whether this last proposition is granted or no, at any rate we observe that Christina had a sufficiently keen appreciation of the duties of children towards their parents, and felt the task of fulfilling them adequately to be so difficult that she was very doubtful how far Ernest and Joey would succeed in mastering it. It is plain in fact that her supposed parting glance upon them was one of suspicion. But there was no suspicion of Theobald, that he should have devoted his life to his children. Why this was such a mere platitude, as almost to go without saying. How, let me ask, was it possible that a child only a little past 5 years old, trained in such an atmosphere of prayers and hymns and psalms and happy Sunday evenings, to say nothing of daily repeated beatings over the said prayers and hymns, etc., about which our authoress is silent, how was it possible that a lad so trained should grow up in any healthy or vigorous development? Even though in her own way his mother was undoubtedly very fond of him, and sometimes told him stories. Can the eye of any reader fail to detect the coming wrath of God as about to descend upon the head of him who should be nurtured under the shadow of such a letter as the foregoing? I have often thought that the Church of Rome does wisely in not allowing her priests to marry. Certainly it is a matter of common observation in England that the sons of clergymen are frequently unsatisfactory. The explanation is very simple, but is so often lost sight of that I may perhaps be pardoned for giving it here. The clergyman is expected to be a kind of human Sunday. Things must not be done in him which are venial in the weekday classes. He is paid for this business of leading a stricter life than other people. It is his raison d'etre. If his parishioners feel that he does this, they approve of him, for they look upon him as their own contribution towards what they deem a holy life. This is why the clergyman is so often called a vicar, he being the person whose vicarious goodness is to stand for that of those entrusted to his charge. But his home is his castle as much as that of any other Englishman, and with him, as with others, unnatural tension in public is followed by exhaustion when tension is no longer necessary. His children are the most defenseless things he can reach, and it is on them in 9 cases out of 10 that he will relieve his mind. A clergyman, again, can hardly ever allow himself to look facts fairly in the face. It is his profession to support one side. It is impossible, therefore, for him to make an unbiased examination of the other. We forget that every clergyman with a living or curacy is as much a paid advocate as the barrister who is trying to persuade a jury to acquit a prisoner. We should listen to him with the same suspense of judgment, the same full consideration of the arguments of the opposing counsel, as a judge does when he is trying a case. Unless we know these, and can state them in a way that our opponents would admit to be a fair representation of their views, we have no right to claim that we have formed an opinion at all. The misfortune is that by the law of the land one side only can be heard. Theobald and Christina were no exceptions to the general rule. When they came to Battersby they had every desire to fulfill the duties of their position, and to devote themselves to the honor and glory of God. But it was Theobald's duty to see the honor and glory of God through the eyes of a church which had lived 300 years without finding reason to change a single one of its opinions. I should doubt whether he ever got as far as doubting the wisdom of his church upon any single matter. His scent for possible mischief was tolerably keen, so was Christina's, and it is likely that if either of them detected in him or herself the first faint symptoms of a want of faith they were nipped no less peremptorily in the bud, than signs of self-will in earnest were, and I should imagine more successfully. Yet Theobald considered himself, and was generally considered to be, and indeed perhaps was, an exceptionally truthful person. Indeed he was generally looked upon as an embodiment of all those virtues which make the poor respectable and the rich respected. In the course of time he and his wife became persuaded even to unconsciousness, that no one could even dwell under their roof without deep cause for thankfulness. Their children, their servants, their parishioners must be fortunate ipso facto that they were theirs. There was no road to happiness here or hereafter, but the road that they had themselves traveled, no good people who did not think as they did upon every subject, and no reasonable person who had wants the gratification of which would be inconvenient to them, Theobald and Christina. This was how it came to pass that their children were white and puny. They were suffering from homesickness. They were starving, through being overcrammed with the wrong things. Nature came down upon them, but she did not come down on Theobald and Christina. Why should she? They were not leading a starved existence. There are 2 classes of people in this world, those who sin, and those who are sinned against. If a man must belong to either, he had better belong to the first than to the second. Chapter 27. I will give no more of the details of my hero's earlier years. Enough that he struggled through them, and at 12 years old knew every page of his Latin and Greek grammars by heart. He had read the greater part of Virgil, Horace, and Livy, and I do not know how many Greek plays. He was proficient in arithmetic, knew the first 4 books of Euclid thoroughly, and had a fair knowledge of French. It was now time he went to school, and to school he was accordingly to go, under the famous Dr. Skinner of Rubborough. Theobald had known Dr. Skinner slightly at Cambridge. He had been a burning and a shining light in every position he had filled from his boyhood upwards. He was a very great genius. Everyone knew this. They said, indeed, that he was one of the few people to whom the word genius could be applied without exaggeration. Had he not taken I don't know how many university scholarships in his freshman's year? Had he not been afterwards senior wrangler, first chancellor's medalist and I do not know how many more things besides? And then, he was such a wonderful speaker. At the Union Debating Club he had been without a rival, and had, of course, been president. His moral character, a point on which so many geniuses were weak, was absolutely irreproachable. Foremost of all, however, among his many great qualities, and perhaps more remarkable even than his genius, was what biographers have called the simple-minded and childlike earnestness of his character. an earnestness which might be perceived by the solemnity with which he spoke even about rifles. It is hardly necessary to say he was on the liberal side in politics. His personal appearance was not particularly prepossessing. He was about the middle height, portly, and had a couple of fierce grey eyes that flashed fire from beneath a pair of great bushy beetling eyebrows and overawed all who came near him. It was in respect of his personal appearance, however, that, if he was vulnerable at all, his weak place was to be found. His hair when he was a young man was red, but after he had taken his degree he had a brain fever which caused him to have his head shaved. When he reappeared, he did so wearing a wig, and one which was a good deal further off red than his own hair had been. He not only had never discarded his wig, but year by year it had edged itself a little more and a little more off red, till by the time he was 40, there was not a trace of red remaining, and his wig was brown. When Dr. Skinner was a very young man, hardly more than 25, the headmastership of Rubborough Grammar School had fallen vacant, and he had been unhesitatingly appointed. The result justified the selection. Dr. Skinner's pupils distinguished themselves at whichever university they went to. He molded their minds after the model of his own, and stamped an impression upon them which was indelible in after life. Whatever else a Rubborough man might be, he was sure to make everyone feel that he was a God-fearing earnest Christian and a liberal, if not a radical, in politics. Some boys, of course, were incapable of appreciating the beauty and loftiness of Dr. Skinner's nature. Some such boys, alas! There will be in every school. Upon them Dr. Skinner's hand was very properly a heavy one. His hand was against them, and theirs against him during the whole time of the connection between them. They not only disliked him, but they hated all that he more especially embodied, and throughout their lives disliked all that reminded them of him. Such boys, however, were in a minority, the spirit of the place being decidedly Skinnerian. I once had the honor of playing a game of chess with this great man. It was during the Christmas holidays, and I had come down to Rubborough for a few days to see Alethea Pontifex, who was then living there, on business. It was very gracious of him to take notice of me, for if I was a light of literature at all it was of the very lightest kind. It is true that in the intervals of business I had written a good deal, but my works had been almost exclusively for the stage, and for those theatres that devoted themselves to extravaganza and burlesque. I had written many pieces of this description, full of puns and comic songs, and they had had a fair success, but my best piece had been a treatment of English history during the Reformation period, in the course of which I had introduced Cranmer, Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, and Thomas Cromwell, in his youth better known as the Malleus Monicorum, and had made them dance a breakdown. I had also dramatized the Pilgrim's Progress for a Christmas pantomime, and made an important scene of Vanity Fair, with Mr. Greatheart, Apollyon, Christiana, Mercy, and Hopeful as the principal characters. The orchestra played music taken from Handel's best-known works, but the time was a good deal altered, and altogether the tunes were not exactly as Handel left them. Mr. Greatheart was very stout and he had a red nose, he wore a capacious waistcoat, and a shirt with a huge frill down the middle of the front. Hopeful was up to as much mischief as I could give him. He wore the costume of a young swell of the period, and had a cigar in his mouth which was continually going out. Christiana did not wear much of anything. Indeed, it was said that the dress which the stage manager had originally proposed for her had been considered inadequate even by the Lord Chamberlain, but this is not the case. With all these delinquencies upon my mind, it was natural that I should feel convinced of sin while playing chess, which I hate, with the great Dr. Skinner of Rubborough, the historian of Athens and editor of Demosthenes. Dr. Skinner, moreover, was one of those who pride themselves on being able to set people at their ease at once, and I had been sitting on the edge of my chair all the evening. But I have always been very easily overawed by a schoolmaster. The game had been a long one, and at 9:30, when supper came in, we had each of us a few pieces remaining. "What will you take for supper, Dr. Skinner?" said Mrs. Skinner in a silvery voice. He made no answer for some time, But at last, in a tone of almost superhuman solemnity, he said, "First, nothing, and then nothing whatever." By and by, however, I had a sense come over me as though I were nearer the consummation of all things than I had ever yet been. The room seemed to grow dark, as an expression came over Dr. Skinner's face, which showed that he was about to speak. The expression gathered force, the room grew darker and darker. "Stay," he at length added, and I felt that here at any rate was an end to a suspense which was rapidly becoming unbearable. "Stay, I may presently take a glass of cold water, and a small piece of bread and butter." As he said the word butter his voice sank to a hardly audible whisper, then there was a sigh as though of relief when the sentence was concluded, and the universe this time was safe. Another 10 minutes of solemn silence finished the game. The doctor rose briskly from his seat and placed himself at the supper table. "Mrs. Skinner," he exclaimed jauntily, "what are those mysterious-looking objects surrounded by potatoes?" "Those are oysters, Dr. Skinner." "Give me some, and give Overton some." And so on till he had eaten a good plate of oysters, a scallop shell of minced veal nicely browned, some apple tart, and a hunk of bread and cheese. This was the small piece of bread and butter. The cloth was now removed and tumblers with teaspoons in them, a lemon or two and a jug of boiling water were placed upon the table. Then the great man unbent. His face beamed. "And what shall be to drink?" he exclaimed persuasively. "Shall it be brandy and water?" "No. It shall be gin and water. Gin is the more wholesome liquor." So gin it was, hot and stiff too. Who can wonder at him or do anything but pity him? Was he not headmaster of Rubborough School? To whom had he owed money at any time? Whose ox had he taken, whose ass had he taken, or whom had he defrauded? What whisper had ever been breathed against his moral character? If he had become rich it was by the most honorable of all means, his literary attainments, over and above his great works of scholarship. His meditations upon the epistle and character of St. Jude had placed him among the most popular of English theologians. It was so exhaustive that no one who bought it need ever meditate upon the subject again. Indeed, it exhausted all who had anything to do with it. He had made £5,000 by this work alone, and would very likely make another £5,000 before he died. A man who had done all this and wanted a piece of bread and butter had a right to announce the fact with some pomp and circumstance. Nor should his words be taken without searching for what he used to call a deeper and more hidden meaning. Those who searched for this even in his lightest utterances would not be without their reward. They would find that bread and butter was Skinnerese for oyster patties and apple tart, and gin hot the true translation of water. But independently of their money value, his works had made him a lasting name in literature. So probably Galileo was under the impression that his fame would rest upon the treatises on natural history which we gather from Seneca that he compiled, and which for aught we know may have contained a complete theory of evolution, but the treatises are all gone and Galileo has become immortal for the very last reason in the world that he expected, and for the very last reason that would have flattered his vanity. He has become immortal because he cared nothing about the most important movement with which he was ever brought into connection. I wish people who are in search of immortality would lay the lesson to heart and not make so much noise about important movements, and so, if Dr. Skinner becomes immortal, it will probably be for some reason very different from the one which he so fondly imagined. Could it be expected to enter into the head of such a man as this that in reality he was making his money by corrupting youth, that it was his paid profession to make the worse appear the better reason in the eyes of those who were too young and inexperienced to be able to find him out, that he kept out of the sight of those whom he professed to teach material points of the argument, for the production of which they had a right to rely upon the honor of anyone who made professions of sincerity, that he was a passionate half-turkey cock half-gander of a man whose sallow, bilious face and hobble-gobble voice could scare the timid, but who would take to his heels readily enough if he were met firmly, that his meditations on St. Jude, such as they were cribbed without acknowledgment, and would have been beneath contempt if so many people did not believe them to have been written honestly? Mrs. Skinner might have perhaps kept him a little more in his proper place if she had thought it worthwhile to try, but she had enough to attend to in looking after her household and seeing that the boys were well fed and, if they were ill, properly looked after, which she took good care they were. Chapter 28. Ernest had heard awful accounts of Dr. Skinner's temper, and of the bullying which the younger boys at Rubborough had to put up with at the hands of the bigger ones. He had now got about as much as he could stand, and felt as though it must go hard with him if his burdens of whatever kind were to be increased. He did not cry on leaving home, but I am afraid he did on being told that he was getting near Rubborough. His father and mother were with him, having posted from home in their own carriage. Rubborough had as yet no railway, and as it was only some 40 miles from Battersby, this was the easiest way of getting there. On seeing him cry, his mother felt flattered and caressed him. She said she knew he must feel very sad at leaving such a happy home, and going among people who, though they would be very good to him, could never be as good as his dear papa, and she had been, still, she was herself, if he only knew it, much more deserving of pity than he was, for the parting was more painful to her than it could possibly be to him, etc., and Ernest, on being told that his tears were for grief at leaving home, took it all on trust, and did not trouble to investigate the real cause of his tears. As they approached Rubborough he pulled himself together, and was fairly calm by the time he reached Dr. Skinner's. On their arrival they had luncheon with the doctor and his wife, and then Mrs. Skinner took Christina over the bedrooms, and showed her where her dear little boy was to sleep. Whatever men may think about the study of man, women do really believe the noblest study for womankind to be woman, and Christina was too much engrossed with Mrs. Skinner to pay much attention to anything else. I dare say Mrs. Skinner, too, was taking pretty accurate stock of Christina. Christina was charmed, as indeed she generally was with any new acquaintance, for she found in them, and so must we all, something of the nature of a cross. As for Mrs. Skinner, I imagine she had seen too many Christinas to find much regeneration in the sample now before her. I believe her private opinion echoed the dictum of a well-known headmaster who declared that all parents were fools, but more especially mothers. She was, however, all smiles and sweetness, and Christina devoured these graciously as tributes paid more particularly to herself, and such as no other mother would have been at all likely to have one. In the meantime Theobald and Ernest were with Dr. Skinner in his library, the room where new boys were examined and old ones had up for rebuke or chastisement. If the walls of that room could speak, what an amount of blundering and capricious cruelty would they not bear witness to! Like all houses, Dr. Skinner's had its peculiar smell. In this case the prevailing odor was one of Russia leather, but along with it there was a subordinate savor as of a chemist's shop. This came from a small laboratory in one corner of the room, the possession of which, together with the free chattery and smattery use of such words as carbonate, hyposulfite, phosphate, and affinity, were enough to convince even the most skeptical that Dr. Skinner had a profound knowledge of chemistry. I may say in passing that Dr. Skinner had dabbled in a great many other things as well as chemistry. He was a man of many small knowledges, and each of them dangerous. I remember Alethea Pontifex once said in her wicked way to me, that Dr. Skinner put her in mind of the Bourbon princes on their return from exile after the Battle of Waterloo, only that he was their exact converse, for whereas they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing, Dr. Skinner had learned everything and forgotten everything. And this puts me in mind of another of her wicked sayings about Dr. Skinner. She told me one day that he had the harmlessness of the serpent and the wisdom of the dove. But to return to Dr. Skinner's library, over the chimney-piece there was a bishop's half-length portrait of Dr. Skinner himself, painted by the elder Pickerskin, whose merit Dr. Skinner had been among the first to discern and foster. There were no other pictures in the library, but in the dining room there was a fine collection, which the doctor had got together with his usual consummate taste. He added to it largely in later life, and when it came to the Hammer at Christie's, as it did not long since, it was found to comprise many of the latest and most matured works of Solomon Hart, O'Neill, Charles Alanzer, and more of our recent academicians than I can at the moment remember. There were thus brought together and exhibited at one view many works which had attracted attention at the Academy exhibitions, and as to whose ultimate destiny there had been some curiosity. The prices realized were disappointing to the executors, but, then, these things are so much a matter of chance. An unscrupulous writer in a well-known weekly paper had written the collection down. Moreover, there had been 1 or 2 large sales a short time before Dr. Skinner's, so that at this last there was rather a panic, and a reaction against the high prices that had ruled lately. The table of the library was loaded with books many deep, MSS. Of all kinds were confusedly mixed up with them, boys' exercises, probably, and examination papers, but all littering untidily about. The room in fact was as depressing from its slatternliness as from its atmosphere of erudition. Theobald and Ernest, as they entered it, stumbled over a large hole in the Turkey carpet, and the dust that rose showed how long it was since it had been taken up and beaten. This, I should say, was no fault of Mrs. Skinner's, but was due to the doctor himself, who declared that if his papers were once disturbed it would be the death of him. Near the window was a green cage containing a pair of turtle doves, whose plaintive cooing added to the melancholy of the place. The walls were covered with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, and on every shelf the books stood in double rows. It was horrible. Prominent among the most prominent upon the most prominent shelf were a series of splendidly bound volumes entitled Skinner's Works. Boys are sadly apt to rush to conclusions, and Ernest believed that Dr. Skinner knew all the books in this terrible library, and that he, if he were to be any good, should have to learn them too. His heart fainted within him. He was told to sit on a chair against the wall and did so, while Dr. Skinner talked to Theobald upon the topics of the day. He talked about the Hampton controversy then raging, and discoursed learnedly about premunire. Then he talked about the revolution which had just broken out in Sicily, and rejoiced that the Pope had refused to allow foreign troops to pass through his dominions in order to crush it. Dr. Skinner and the other masters took in the Times among them, and Dr. Skinner echoed the Times leaders. In those days there were no penny papers, and Theobald only took in the Spectator, for he was at that time on the Whig side in politics. Besides this, he used to receive the Ecclesiastical Gazette once a month, but he saw no other papers, and was amazed at the ease and fluency with which Dr. Skinner ran from subject to subject. The Pope's action in the matter of the Sicilian Revolution naturally led the doctor to the reforms which His Holiness had introduced into his dominions, and he laughed consumedly over the joke which had not long since appeared in Punch, to the effect that Pio no, should rather have been named Pio yes, because, as the doctor explained, he granted everything his subjects asked for. Anything like a pun went straight to Dr. Skinner's heart. Then he went on to the matter of these reforms themselves. They opened up a new era in the history of Christendom, and would have such momentous and far-reaching consequences, that they might even lead to a reconciliation between the churches of England and Rome. Dr. Skinner had lately published a pamphlet upon this subject, which had shown great learning, and had attacked the Church of Rome in a way which did not promise much hope of reconciliation. He had grounded his attack upon the letters AMDG, which he had seen outside a Roman Catholic chapel, and which of course stood for Ad Mariam Digenitricem. Could anything be more idolatrous? I am told, by the way, that I must have let my memory play me one of the tricks it often does play me, when I said the doctor proposed Ad Mariam Digenitricem as the full harmonies, so to speak, which should be constructed upon the base AMDG, for that this is bad Latin, and that the doctor really harmonized the letters thus, Ave Maria Digenitrix. No doubt the doctor did what was right in the matter of Latinity. I have forgotten the little Latin I ever knew, and am not going to look the matter up, but I believe the doctor said Ad Mariam Digenitricem, and if so we may be sure that Ad Mariam Digenitricem is good enough Latin at any rate for ecclesiastical purposes. The reply of the local priest had not yet appeared, and Dr. Skinner was jubilant, but when the answer appeared, and it was solemnly declared that AMDG stood for nothing more dangerous than ad majorem de gloriam. It was felt that though this subterfuge would not succeed with any intelligent Englishman, still it was a pity Dr. Skinner had selected this particular point for his attack, for he had to leave his enemy in possession of the field. When people are left in possession of the field, spectators have an awkward habit of thinking that their adversary does not dare to come to the scratch. Dr. Skinner was telling Theobald all about his pamphlet, and I doubt whether this gentleman was much more comfortable than Ernest himself. He was bored, for in his heart he hated liberalism, though he was ashamed to say so, and, as I have said, professed to be on the Whig side. He did not want to be reconciled to the Church of Rome. He wanted to make all Roman Catholics turn Protestants, and could never understand why they would not do so, but the doctor talked in such a truly liberal spirit, and shut him up so sharply when he tried to edge in a word or two, that he had to let him have it all his own way, and this was not what he was accustomed to. He was wondering how he could bring it to an end, when a diversion was created by the discovery that Ernest had begun to cry, doubtless through an intense but inarticulate sense of a boredom greater than he could bear. He was evidently in a highly nervous state, and a good deal upset by the excitement of the morning. Mrs. Skinner therefore, who came in with Christina at this juncture, proposed that he should spend the afternoon with Mrs. J., the matron, and not be introduced to his young companions until the following morning. His father and mother now bade him an affectionate farewell, and the lad was handed over to Mrs. J. O schoolmasters, if any of you read this book, bear in mind when any particularly timid drivelling urchin is brought by his papa into your study, and you treat him with the contempt which he deserves, and afterwards make his life a burden to him for years, bear in mind that it is exactly in the disguise of such a boy as this that your future chronicler will appear. Never see a wretched little heavy-eyed mite sitting on the edge of a chair against your study wall without saying to yourselves, perhaps this boy is he who, if I am not careful, will one day tell the world what manner of man I was. If even 2 or 3 schoolmasters learn this lesson and remember it, the preceding chapters will not have been written in vain. Chapter 29. Soon after his father and mother had left him, Ernest dropped asleep over a book which Mrs. J. had given him, and he did not awake till dusk. Then he sat down on a stool in front of the fire, which showed pleasantly in the late January twilight, and began to muse. He felt weak, feeble, ill at ease and unable to see his way out of the innumerable troubles that were before him. Perhaps, he said to himself, he might even die, but this, far from being an end of his troubles, would prove the beginning of new ones, for at the best he would only go to Grandpapa Pontifex and Grandmama Ullaby, and though they would perhaps be more easy to get on with than Papa and Mama, yet they were undoubtedly not so really good, and were more worldly. Moreover, they were grown-up people, especially Grandpapa Pontifex, who so far as he could understand had been very much grown up, and he did not know why, but there was always something that kept him from loving any grown-up people very much, except 1 or 2 of the servants, who had indeed been as nice as anything that he could imagine. Besides, even if he were to die and go to heaven, he supposed he should have to complete his education somewhere. In the meantime his father and mother were rolling along the muddy roads, each in his or her own corner of the carriage, and each revolving many things which were and were not to come to pass. Times have changed since I last showed them to the reader as sitting together silently in a carriage, but except as regards their mutual relations, they have altered singularly little. When I was younger I used to think the prayer book was wrong in requiring us to say the general confession twice a week from childhood to old age, without making provision for our not being quite such great sinners at 70 as we had been at 7. Granted that we should go to the wash like tablecloths at least once a week, still I used to think a day ought to come when we should want rather less rubbing and scrubbing at. Now that I have grown older myself, I have seen that the Church has estimated probabilities better than I had done. The pair said not a word to one another, but watched the fading light and naked trees, the brown fields with here and there a melancholy cottage by the roadside, and the rain that fell fast upon the carriage windows. It was a kind of afternoon on which nice people for the most part like to be snug at home, and Theobald was a little snappish at reflecting how many miles he had to post before he could be at his own fireside again. However, there was nothing for it, so the pair sat quietly and watched the roadside objects flit by them, and get grayer and grimmer as the light faded. Though they spoke not to one another, there was one nearer to each of them with whom they could converse freely. "I hope," said Theobald to himself, "I hope he'll work, or else that Skinner will make him. I don't like Skinner, I never did like him, but he is unquestionably a man of genius, and no one turns out so many pupils who succeed at Oxford and Cambridge, and that is the best test. I have done my share towards starting him well." Skinner said he had been well grounded and was very forward. "I suppose he will presume upon it now and do nothing, for his nature is an idle one. He is not fond of me, I'm sure he is not. He ought to be after all the trouble I have taken with him, but he is ungrateful and selfish. It is an unnatural thing for a boy not to be fond of his own father. If he was fond of me I should be fond of him, but I cannot like a son who, I am sure, dislikes me. He shrinks out of my way whenever he sees me coming near him. He will not stay 5 minutes in the same room with me if he can help it. He is deceitful. He would not want to hide himself away so much if he were not deceitful. That is a bad sign and one which makes me fear he will grow up extravagant. I am sure he will grow up extravagant. I should have given him more pocket money if I had not known this, but what is the good of giving him pocket money? It is all gone directly. If he doesn't buy something with it he gives it away to the first little boy or girl he sees who takes his fancy. He forgets that it's my money he is giving away. I give him money that he may have money and learn to know its uses, not that he may go and squander it immediately. I wish he was not so fond of music, it will interfere with his Latin and Greek. I will stop it as much as I can. Why, when he was translating Livy the other day he slipped out Handel's name in mistake for Hannibal's, and his mother tells me he knows half the tunes in the Messiah by heart. What should a boy of his age know about the Messiah? If I had shown half as many dangerous tendencies when I was a boy, my father would have apprenticed me to a greengrocer, of that I'm very sure, etc., etc. Then his thoughts turned to Egypt and the 10th plague. It seemed to him that if the little Egyptians had been anything like Ernest, the plague must have been something very like a blessing in disguise. If the Israelites were to come to England now he should be greatly tempted not to let them go. Mrs. Theobald's thoughts ran in a different current. Lord Lonsford's grandson, it's a pity his name is Figgins, however, blood is blood as much through the female line as the male, indeed, perhaps even more so if the truth were known. I wonder who Mr. Figgins was. I think Mrs. Skinner said he was dead, however, I must find out all about him. It would be delightful if young Figgins were to ask Ernest home for the holidays. Who knows but he might meet Lord Lonsford himself, or at any rate some of Lord Lonsford's other descendants. Meanwhile the boy himself was still sitting moodily before the fire in Mrs. J's room. Papa and Mama, he was saying to himself, are much better and cleverer than anyone else, but, I, alas, shall never be either good or clever. Mrs. Pontifex continued, perhaps it would be best to get young Figgins on a visit to ourselves first. That would be charming. Theobald would not like it, for he does not like children. I must see how I can manage it, for it would be so nice to have young Figgins, or stay. Ernest shall go and stay with Figgins and meet the future Lord Lonsford, who I should think must be about Ernest's age, and then if he and Ernest were to become friends Ernest might ask him to Battersby, and he might fall in love with Charlotte. I think we have done most wisely in sending Ernest to Dr. Skinner's. Dr. Skinner's piety is no less remarkable than his genius. One can tell these things at a glance, and he must have felt it about me no less strongly than I about him. I think he seemed much struck with Theobald and myself. Indeed, Theobald's intellectual power must impress anyone, and I was showing, I do believe, to my best advantage. When I smiled at him and said I left my boy in his hands with the most entire confidence that he would be as well cared for as if he were at my own house, I am sure he was greatly pleased. I should not think many of the mothers who bring him boys can impress him so favorably, or say such nice things to him as I did. My smile is sweet when I desire to make it so. I never was perhaps exactly pretty, but I was always admitted to be fascinating. Dr. Skinner is a very handsome man, too good on the whole I should say for Mrs. Skinner. Theobald says he is not handsome, but men are no judges, and he has such a pleasant bright face. I think my bonnet became me. As soon as I get home I will tell Chambers to trim my blue and yellow merino with, etc., etc. All this time the letter which has been given above was lying in Christina's private little Japanese cabinet, read and reread and approved of many times over, not to say, if the truth were known, rewritten more than once, though dated as in the first instance, and this, too, though Christina was fond enough of a joke in a small way. Ernest, still in Mrs. J's room, mused onward. Grown-up people, he said to himself, when they were ladies and gentlemen, never did naughty things, but he was always doing them. He had heard that some grown-up people were worldly, which of course was wrong, still this was quite distinct from being naughty, and did not get them punished or scolded. His own papa and mamma were not even worldly, they had often explained to him that they were exceptionally unworldly. He well knew that they had never done anything naughty since they had been children, and that even as children they had been nearly faultless. Oh! How different from himself! When should he learn to love his papa and mamma as they had loved theirs? How could he hope ever to grow up to be as good and wise as they, or even tolerably good and wise? Alas! Never! It could not be. He did not love his papa and mamma, in spite of all their goodness both in themselves and to him. He hated papa, and did not like mamma, and this was what none but a bad and ungrateful boy would do after all that had been done for him. Besides, he did not like Sunday, he did not like anything that was really good, his tastes were low and such as he was ashamed of. He liked people best if they sometimes swore a little, so long as it was not at him. As for his catechism and Bible readings, he had no heart in them. He had never attended to a sermon in his life. Even when he had been taken to hear Mr. Vaughan at Brighton, who, as everyone knew, preached such beautiful sermons for children, he had been very glad when it was all over, nor did he believe he could get through church at all if it was not for the voluntary upon the organ and the hymns and chanting. The catechism was awful. He had never been able to understand what it was that he desired of his Lord God and Heavenly Father, nor had he yet got hold of a single idea in connection with the word sacrament. His duty towards his neighbor was another bugbear. It seemed to him that he had duties towards everybody, lying in wait for him upon every side, but that nobody had any duties towards him. Then there was that awful and mysterious word business. What did it all mean? What was business? His papa was a wonderfully good man of business, his mamma had often told him so, but he should never be one. It was hopeless, and very awful, for people were continually telling him that he would have to earn his own living. No doubt, but how, considering how stupid, idle, ignorant, self-indulgent, and physically puny he was? All grown-up people were clever, except servants, and even these were cleverer than ever he should be. Oh, why, could not people be born into the world as grown-up persons? Then he thought of Casabianca. He had been examined in that poem by his father not long before. When only would he leave his position? To whom did he call? Did he get an answer? Why? How many times did he call upon his father? What happened to him? What was the noblest life that perished there? Do you think so? Why do you think so? And all the rest of it. Of course he thought Casabianca's was the noblest life that perished there could be no two opinions about that. It never occurred to him that the moral of the poem was that young people cannot begin too soon to exercise discretion in the obedience they pay to their papa and mamma. Oh, no. The only thought in his mind was that he should never have been like Casabianca, and that Casabianca would have despised him so much, if he could have known him, that he would not have condescended to speak to him. There was nobody else in the ship worth reckoning at all. It did not matter how much they were blown up. Mrs. Hemans knew them all, and they were a very indifferent lot. Besides, Casabianca was so good-looking and came of such a good family. And thus his small mind kept wandering on till he could follow it no longer, and again went off into a doze. Chapter 30. Next morning Theobald and Christina arose feeling a little tired from their journey, but happy in that best of all happiness, the approbation of their consciences. It would be their boy's fault henceforth if he were not good, and as prosperous as it was at all desirable that he should be. What more could parents do than they had done? The answer nothing will rise as readily to the lips of the reader as to those of Theobald and Christina themselves. A few days later the parents were gratified at receiving the following letter from their son: "My dear Mamma, I am very well. Dr. Skinner made me do about the horse free and exulting roaming in the wide fields in Latin verse, but as I had done it with Papa I knew how to do it, and it was nearly all right, and he put me in the fourth form under Mr. Templar, and I have to begin a new Latin grammar, not like the old, but much harder. I know you wish me to work, and I will try very hard. With best love to Joey and Charlotte, and to Papa, I remain, your affectionate son, Ernest." Nothing could be nicer or more proper. It really did seem as though he were inclined to turn over a new leaf. The boys had all come back, the examinations were over, and the routine of the half-year began. Ernest found that his fears about being kicked about and bullied were exaggerated. Nobody did anything very dreadful to him. He had to run errands between certain hours for the elder boys, and to take his turn at greasing the footballs, and so forth, but there was an excellent spirit in the school as regards bullying. Nevertheless, he was far from happy. Dr. Skinner was much too like his father. True, Ernest was not thrown in with him much yet, but he was always there. There was no knowing at what moment he might not put in an appearance, and whenever he did show, it was to storm about something. He was like the lion in the Bishop of Oxford's Sunday story, always liable to rush out from behind some bush and devour someone when he was least expected. He called Ernest an audacious reptile and said he wondered the earth did not open and swallow him up because he pronounced Talia with a short I. This to me," he thundered, "who never made a false quantity in my life. Surely he would have been a much nicer person if he had made false quantities in his youth like other people." Ernest could not imagine how the boys in Dr. Skinner's form continued to live, but yet they did, and even throve, and, strange as it may seem, idolized him, or professed to do so in after life. To Ernest it seemed like living on the crater of Vesuvius. He was himself, as has been said, in Mr. Templar's form, who was snappish, but not downright wicked, and was very easy to crib under. Ernest used to wonder how Mr. Templar could be so blind, for he supposed Mr. Templar must have cribbed when he was at school, and would ask himself whether he should forget his youth when he got old, as Mr. Templar had forgotten his. He used to think he never could possibly forget any part of it. Then there was Mrs. J., who was sometimes very alarming. A few days after the half-year had commenced, there being some little extra noise in the hall, she rushed in with her spectacles on her forehead and her cap strings flying, and called the boy whom Ernest had selected as his hero the rampinest, scampinest, rackety, tackety-tal-roarinest boy in the whole school. But she used to say things that Ernest liked. If the doctor went out to dinner, and there were no prayers, she would come in and say, "Young gentlemen, prayers are excused this evening," and, take her for all in all, she was a kindly old soul enough. Most boys soon discover the difference between noise and actual danger, but to others it is so unnatural to menace, unless they mean mischief, that they are long before they leave off taking turkey cocks and ganders ocerux. Ernest was one of the latter sort, and found the atmosphere of rubero so gusty that he was glad to shrink out of sight and out of mind whenever he could. He disliked the games worse even than the squalls of the classroom and hall, for he was still feeble, not filling out and attaining his full strength till a much later age than most boys. This was perhaps due to the closeness with which his father had kept him to his books in childhood, but I think in part also to a tendency towards lateness in attaining maturity, hereditary in the Pontifex family, which was one also of unusual longevity. At 13 or 14 he was a mere bag of bones, with upper arms about as thick as the wrists of other boys of his age. His little chest was pigeon-breasted, he appeared to have no strength or stamina whatever, and finding he always went to the wall in physical encounters, whether undertaken in jest or earnest, even with boys shorter than himself, the timidity natural to childhood increased upon him to an extent that I am afraid amounted to cowardice. This rendered him even less capable than he might otherwise have been, for as confidence increases power, so want of confidence increases impotence. After he had had the breath knocked out of him and been well shinned half a dozen times in scrimmages at football, scrimmages in which he had become involved sorely against his will, he ceased to see any further fun in football, and shirked that noble game in a way that got him into trouble with the elder boys, who would stand no shirking on the part of the younger ones. He was as useless and ill at ease with cricket as with football, nor in spite of all his efforts could he ever throw a ball or a stone. It soon became plain, therefore, to everyone that Pontifex was a young muff, a mollycoddle, not to be tortured, but still not to be rated highly. He was not, however, actively unpopular, for it was seen that he was quite square in terpairs, not at all vindictive, easily pleased, perfectly free with whatever little money he had, no greater lover of his schoolwork than of the games, and generally more inclinable to moderate vice than to immoderate virtue. These qualities will prevent any boy from sinking very low in the opinion of his schoolfellows, but Ernest thought he had fallen lower than he probably had, and hated and despised himself for what he, as much as anyone else, believed to be his cowardice. He did not like the boys whom he thought like himself. His heroes were strong and vigorous, and the less they inclined towards him the more he worshipped them. All this made him very unhappy, for it never occurred to him that the instinct which made him keep out of games for which he was ill-adapted, was more reasonable than the reason which would have driven him into them. Nevertheless he followed his instinct for the most part, rather than his reason. Sapiens suam si sapientiam norit. Chapter 31. With the masters Ernest was ere long in absolute disgrace. He had more liberty now than he had known heretofore. The heavy hand and watchful eye of Theobald were no longer about his path and about his bed unspying out all his ways, and punishment by way of copying outlines of Virgil was a very different thing from the savage beatings of his father. The copying out in fact was often less trouble than the lesson. Latin and Greek had nothing in them which commended them to his instinct as likely to bring him peace even at the last, still less did they hold out any hope of doing so within some more reasonable time. The deadness inherent in these defunct languages themselves had never been artificially counteracted by a system of bona fide rewards for application. There had been any amount of punishments for want of application, but no good comfortable bribes had baited the hook which was to allure him to his good. Indeed, the more pleasant side of learning to do this or that had always been treated as something with which Ernest had no concern. We had no business with pleasant things at all, at any rate very little business, at any rate not he, Ernest. We were put into this world not for pleasure but duty, and pleasure had in it something more or less sinful in its very essence. If we were doing anything we liked, we, or at any rate he, Ernest, should apologize and think he was being very mercifully dealt with, if not at once told to go and do something else. With what he did not like, however, it was different. The more he disliked a thing the greater the presumption that it was right. It never occurred to him that the presumption was in favor of the rightness of what was most pleasant, and that the onus of proving that it was not right lay with those who disputed its being so. I have said more than once that he believed in his own depravity. Never was there a little mortal more ready to accept without cavil whatever he was told by those who were in authority over him. He thought, at least, that he believed it, for as yet he knew nothing of that other Ernest that dwelt within him, and was so much stronger and more real than the Ernest of which he was conscious. The dumb Ernest, persuaded with inarticulate feelings too swift and sure to be translated into such debatable things as words, but practically insisted as follows: growing is not the easy plain sailing business that it is commonly supposed to be. It is hard work, harder than any but a growing boy can understand. It requires attention, and you are not strong enough to attend to your bodily growth, and to your lessons too. Besides, Latin and Greek are great humbug. The more people know of them, the more odious they generally are. The nice people whom you delight in either never knew any at all or forgot what they had learned as soon as they could. They never turned to the classics after they were no longer forced to read them, therefore they are nonsense, all very well in their own time and country, but out of place here. Never learn anything until you find you have been made uncomfortable for a good long while by not knowing it. When you find that you have occasion for this or that knowledge, or foresee that you will have occasion for it shortly, the sooner you learn it the better, but till then spend your time in growing bone and muscle. These will be much more useful to you than Latin and Greek, nor will you ever be able to make them if you do not do so now, whereas Latin and Greek can be acquired at any time by those who want them. You are surrounded on every side by lies which would deceive even the elect, if the elect were not generally so uncommonly wide awake. The self of which you are conscious, your reasoning and reflecting self, will believe these lies and bid you act in accordance with them. This conscious self of yours, Ernest, is a prig begotten of prigs and trained in priggishness. I will not allow it to shape your actions, though it will doubtless shape your words for many a year to come. Your papa is not here to beat you now. This is a change in the conditions of your existence, and should be followed by changed actions. Obey me, your true self, and things will go tolerably well with you, but only listen to that outward and visible old husk of yours which is called your father, and I will rend you in pieces even unto the third and fourth generation as one who has hated God, for I, Ernest, am the God who made you. How shocked Ernest would have been if he could have heard the advice he was receiving, what consternation too there would have been at Battersby, but the matter did not end here, for this same wicked inner self gave him bad advice about his pocket money, the choice of his companions, and on the whole Ernest was attentive and obedient to its behests, more so than Theobald had been. The consequence was that he learned little, his mind growing more slowly and his body rather faster than heretofore. And when by and by his inner self urged him in directions where he met obstacles beyond his strength to combat, he took, though with passionate compunctions of conscience, the nearest course to the one from which he was debarred which circumstances would allow. It may be guessed that Ernest was not the chosen friend of the more sedate and well-conducted youths then studying at Rubborough. Some of the less desirable boys used to go to public houses and drink more beer than was good for them. Ernest's inner self can hardly have told him to ally himself to these young gentlemen, but he did so at an early age, and was sometimes made pitiably sick by an amount of beer which would have produced no effect upon a stronger boy. Ernest's inner self must have interposed at his point and told him that there was not much fun in this, for he dropped the habit ere it had taken firm hold of him, and never resumed it. But he contracted another at the disgracefully early age of between 13 and 14 which he did not relinquish, though to the present day his conscious self keeps stinging it into him that the less he smokes the better. And so matters went on till my hero was nearly 14 years old. If by that time he was not actually a young blackguard, he belonged to a debatable class between the subreputable and the upper disreputable, with perhaps rather more leaning to the latter except so far as vices of meanness were concerned, from which he was fairly free. I gather this partly from what Ernest has told me, and partly from his school bills which I remember Theobald showed me with much complaining. There was an institution at Rubborough called the monthly merit money. The maximum sum which a boy of Ernest's age could get was 4 shillings and 6pence. Several boys got 4 shillings and few less than 6pence. But Ernest never got more than half a crown and seldom more than 18 pence. His average would, I should think, be about 1 and 9 pence, which was just too much for him to rank among the downright bad boys, but too little to put him among the good ones. Chapter 32. I must now return to Miss Alethea Pontifex, of whom I have said perhaps too little hitherto, considering how great her influence upon my hero's destiny proved to be. On the death of her father, which happened when she was about 32 years old, she parted company with her sisters, between whom and herself there had been little sympathy, and came up to London. She was determined, so she said, to make the rest of her life as happy as she could, and she had clearer ideas about the best way of setting to work to do this than women, or indeed men, generally have. Her fortune consisted, as I have said, of £5,000, which had come to her by her mother's marriage settlements, and £15,000 left her by her father, over both which sums she had now absolute control. These brought her in about £900 a year, and the money being invested in none but the soundest securities, she had no anxiety about her income. She meant to be rich, so she formed a scheme of expenditure which involved an annual outlay of about £500, and determined to put the rest by. "If I do this," she said laughingly, "I shall probably just succeed in living comfortably within my income." In accordance with this scheme she took unfurnished apartments in a house in Gower Street, of which the lower floors were let out as offices. John Pontifex tried to get her to take a house to herself, but Alethea told him to mind his own business so plainly that he had to beat a retreat. She had never liked him, and from that time dropped him almost entirely. Without going much into society she yet became acquainted with most of the men and women who had attained a position in the literary, artistic and scientific worlds, and it was singular how highly her opinion was valued in spite of her never having attempted in any way to distinguish herself. She could have written if she had chosen, but she enjoyed seeing others write and encouraging them better than taking a more active part herself. Perhaps literary people liked her all the better because she did not write. I, as she very well knew, had always been devoted to her, and she might have had a score of other admirers if she had liked, but she had discouraged them all, and railed at matrimony as women seldom do unless they have a comfortable income of their own. She by no means, however, railed at man as she railed at matrimony, and though living after a fashion in which even the most censorious could find nothing to complain of, as far as she properly could she defended those of her own sex whom the world condemned most severely. In religion she was, I should think, as nearly a freethinker as anyone could be whose mind seldom turned upon the subject. She went to church, but disliked equally those who aired either religion or irreligion. I remember once hearing her press a late well-known philosopher to write a novel instead of pursuing his attacks upon religion. The philosopher did not much like this, and dilated upon the importance of showing people the folly of much that they pretended to believe. She smiled and said demurely, "Have they not Moses and the prophets? Let them hear them." But she would say a wicked thing quietly on her own account sometimes, and called my attention once to a note in her prayer book which gave account of the walk to Emmaus with the 2 disciples, and how Christ had said to them, "O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken," the all being printed in small capitals. Though scarcely on terms with her brother John, she had kept up closer relations with Theobald and his family, and had paid a few days' visit to Battersby once in every 2 years or so. Alethea had always tried to like Theobald and join forces with him as much as she could, for they too were the hares of the family, the rest being all hounds, but it was no use. I believe her chief reason for maintaining relations with her brother was that she might keep an eye on his children and give them a lift if they proved nice. When Miss Pontifex had come down to Battersby in old times the children had not been beaten, and their lessons had been made lighter. She easily saw that they were overworked and unhappy, but she could hardly guess how all-reaching was the regime under which they lived. She knew she could not interfere effectually then, and wisely forbore to make too many inquiries. Her time, if ever it was to come, would be when the children were no longer living under the same roof as their parents. It ended in her making up her mind to have nothing to do with either Joey or Charlotte, but to see so much of Ernest as should enable her to form an opinion about his disposition and abilities. He had now been a year and a half at Rubborough and was nearly 14 years old, so that his character had begun to shape. His aunt had not seen him for some little time and, thinking that if she was to exploit him she could do so now perhaps better than at any other time, she resolved to go down to Rubborough on some pretext which should be good enough for Theobald, and to take stock of her nephew under circumstances in which she could get him for some few hours to herself. Accordingly, in August 1849, when Ernest was just entering on his fourth half-year, a cab drove up to Dr. Skinner's door with Miss Pontifex, who asked and obtained leave for Ernest to come and dine with her at the Swan Hotel. She had written to Ernest to say she was coming, and he was of course on the lookout for her. He had not seen her for so long that he was rather shy at first, but her good nature soon set him at his ease. She was so strongly biased in favor of anything young that her heart warmed towards him at once, though his appearance was less prepossessing than she had hoped. She took him to a cake shop and gave him whatever he liked as soon as she had got him off the school premises, and Ernest felt at once that she contrasted favorably even with his aunts the Misses Illiby, who were so very sweet and good. The Misses Illiby were very poor. 6pence was to them what 5 shillings was to Alethea. What chance had they against one who, if she had a mind, could put by out of her income twice as much as they, poor women, could spend? The boy had plenty of prattle in him when he was not snubbed, and Alethea encouraged him to chatter about whatever came uppermost. He was always ready to trust anyone who was kind to him. It took many years to make him reasonably wary in this respect, if indeed, as I sometimes doubt, he ever will be as wary as he ought to be, and in a short time he had quite dissociated his aunt from his papa and mamma and the rest, with whom his instinct told him he should be on his guard. Little did he know how great, as far as he was concerned, were the issues that depended upon his behavior. If he had known, he would perhaps have played his part less successfully. His aunt drew from him more details of his home and school life than his papa and mamma would have approved of, but he had no idea that he was being pumped. She got out of him all about the happy Sunday evenings, and how he and Joey and Charlotte quarreled sometimes, but she took no side and treated everything as though it were a matter of course. Like all the boys, he could mimic Dr. Skinner, and when warmed with dinner, and 2 glasses of sherry which made him nearly tipsy, he favored his aunt with samples of the doctor's manner and spoke of him familiarly as Sam. "Sam," he said, "is an awful old humbug." It was the sherry that brought out this piece of swagger, for whatever else he was, Dr. Skinner was a reality to Master Ernest, before which, indeed, he sank into his boots in no time. Alethea smiled and said, "I must not say anything to that, must I?" Ernest said, "I suppose not," and was checked. By and by he vented a number of small second-hand priggishnesses which he had caught up believing them to be the correct thing, and made it plain that even at that early age Ernest believed in Ernest with a belief which was amusing from its absurdity. His aunt judged him charitably, as she was sure to do. She knew very well where the priggishness came from, and seeing that the string of his tongue had been loosened sufficiently gave him no more sherry. It was after dinner, however, that he completed the conquest of his aunt. She then discovered that, like herself, he was passionately fond of music, and that, too, of the highest class. He knew, and hummed or whistled to her all sorts of pieces out of the works of the great masters, which a boy of his age could hardly be expected to know, and it was evident that this was purely instinctive, inasmuch as music received no kind of encouragement at Rubborough. There was no boy in the school as fond of music as he was. He picked up his knowledge, he said, from the organist of St. Michael's Church, who used to practice sometimes on a weekday afternoon. Ernest had heard the organ booming away as he was passing outside the church and had sneaked inside and up into the organ loft. In the course of time the organist became accustomed to him as a familiar visitant, and the pair became friends. It was this which decided Alethea that the boy was worth taking pains with. "He likes the best music," she thought, "and he hates Dr. Skinner. This is a very fair beginning." When she sent him away at night with a sovereign in his pocket, and he had only hoped to get 5 shillings, she felt as though she had had a good deal more than her money's worth for her money. Chapter 33. Next day Miss Pontifex returned to town, with her thoughts full of her nephew and how she could best be of use to him. It appeared to her that to do him any real service she must devote herself almost entirely to him. She must in fact give up living in London, at any rate for a long time, and live at Rubborough where she could see him continually. This was a serious undertaking. She had lived in London for the last 12 years, and naturally disliked the prospect of a small country town such as Rubborough. Was it a prudent thing to attempt so much? Must not people take their chances in this world? Can anyone do much for anyone else unless by making a will in his favor and dying then and there? Should not each look after his own happiness, and will not the world be best carried on if everyone minds his own business and leaves other people to mind theirs? Life is not a donkey race in which everyone is to ride his neighbor's donkey and the last is to win. And the psalmist long since formulated a common experience when he declared that no man may deliver his brother nor make agreement unto God for him, for it cost more to redeem their souls, so that he must let that alone forever. All these excellent reasons for letting her nephew alone occurred to her, and many more, but against them there pleaded a woman's love for children, and her desire to find someone among the younger branches of her own family to whom she could become warmly attached, and whom she could attach warmly to herself. Over and above this she wanted someone to leave her money to. She was not going to leave it to people about whom she knew very little, merely because they happened to be sons and daughters of brothers and sisters whom she had never liked. She knew the power and value of money exceedingly well, and how many lovable people suffer and die yearly for the want of it. She was little likely to leave it without being satisfied that her legatees were square, lovable, and more or less hard up. She wanted those to have it who would be most likely to use it genially and sensibly, and whom it would thus be likely to make most happy. If she could find one such among her nephews and nieces, so much the better. It was worth taking a great deal of pains to see whether she could or could not, but if she failed, she must find an heir who was not related to her by blood. Of course, she had said to me, more than once, I shall make a mess of it. I shall choose some nice-looking, well-dressed screw, with gentlemanly manners which will take me in, and he will go and paint Academy pictures, or write for the Times, or do something just as horrid the moment the breath is out of my body. As yet, however, she had made no will at all, and this was one of the few things that troubled her. I believe she would have left most of her money to me if I had not stopped her. My father left me abundantly well off, and my mode of life has been always simple, so that I have never known uneasiness about money. Moreover, I was especially anxious that there should be no occasion given for ill-natured talk. She knew well, therefore, that her leaving her money to me would be of all things the most likely to weaken the ties that existed between us, provided that I was aware of it, but I did not mind her talking about whom she should make her heir, so long as it was well understood that I was not to be the person. Ernest had satisfied her as having enough in him to tempt her strongly to take him up, but it was not till after many days' reflection that she gravitated towards actually doing so, with all the break in her daily ways that this would entail. At least, she said it took her some days, and certainly it appeared to do so, but from the moment she had begun to broach the subject, I had guessed how things were going to end. It was now arranged she should take a house at Rubborough, and go and live there for a couple of years. As a compromise, however, to meet some of my objections, it was also arranged that she should keep her rooms in Gower Street, and come to town for a week once in each month. Of course, also, she would leave Rubborough for the greater part of the holidays. After 2 years, the thing was to come to an end, unless it proved a great success. She should by that time, at any rate, have made up her mind what the boy's character was, and would then act as circumstances might determine. The pretext she put forward ostensibly was that her doctor said she ought to be a year or 2 in the country after so many years of London life, and had recommended Rubborough on account of the purity of its air, and its easy access to and from London, for by this time the railway had reached it. She was anxious not to give her brother and sister any right to complain, if on seeing more of her nephew she found she could not get on with him, and she was also anxious not to raise false hopes of any kind in the boy's own mind. Having settled how everything was to be, she wrote to Theobald and said she meant to take a house in Rubborough from the Michaelmas then approaching, and mentioned, as though casually, that one of the attractions of the place would be that her nephew was at school there and she should hope to see more of him than she had done hitherto. Theobald and Christina knew how dearly Alethea loved London, and thought it very odd that she should want to go and live at Rubborough, but they did not suspect that she was going there solely on her nephew's account, much less that she had thought of making Ernest her heir. If they had guessed this, they would have been so jealous that I half believe they would have asked her to go and live somewhere else. Alethea, however, was 2 or 3 years younger than Theobald. She was still some years short of 50, and might very well live to 85 or 90. Her money, therefore, was not worth taking much trouble about, and her brother and sister-in-law had dismissed it, so to speak, from their minds with costs, assuming, however, that if anything did happen to her while they were still alive, the money would, as a matter of course, come to them. The prospect of Alethea seeing much of Ernest was a serious matter. Christina smelt mischief from afar, as indeed she often did. Alethea was worldly, that is to say, as a sister of Theobald's could be. In her letter to Theobald she had said she knew how much of his and Christina's thoughts were taken up with anxiety for the boy's welfare. Alethea had thought this handsome enough, but Christina had wanted something better and stronger. "How can she know how much we think of our darling?" she had exclaimed, when Theobald showed her his sister's letter. "I think, my dear, Alethea would understand these things better if she had children of her own." The least that would have satisfied Christina was to have been told that there never yet had been any parents comparable to Theobald and herself. She did not feel easy that an alliance of some kind would not grow up between aunt and nephew, and neither she nor Theobald wanted Ernest to have any allies. Joey and Charlotte were quite as many allies as were good for him. After all, however, if Alethea chose to go and live at Rubborough, they could not well stop her, and must make the best of it. In a few weeks' time Alethea did choose to go and live at Rubborough. A house was found with a field and a nice little garden which suited her very well. "At any rate," she said to herself, "I will have fresh eggs and flowers." She even considered the question of keeping a cow, but in the end decided not to do so. She furnished her house throughout anew, taking nothing whatever from her establishment in Gower Street, and by Michaelmas, for the house was empty when she took it, she was settled comfortably, and had begun to make herself at home. One of Miss Pontifex's first moves was to ask a dozen of the smartest and most gentlemanly boys to breakfast with her. From her seat in church she could see the faces of the upper form boys, and soon made up her mind which of them it would be best to cultivate. Miss Pontifex, sitting opposite the boys in church, and reckoning them up with her keen eyes from under her veil by all a woman's criteria, came to a truer conclusion about the greater number of those she scrutinized than even Dr. Skinner had done. She fell in love with one boy from seeing him put on his gloves. Miss Pontifex, as I have said, got hold of some of these youngsters through the Ernest, and fed them well. No boy can resist being fed well by a good-natured and still handsome woman. Boys are very like nice dogs in this respect, give them a bone and they will like you at once. Alethea employed every other little artifice which she thought likely to win their allegiance to herself, and through this their countenance for her nephew. She found the football club in a slight money difficulty and at once gave half a sovereign towards its removal. The boys had no chance against her, she shot them down one after another as easily as though they had been roosting pheasants. Nor did she escape scatheless herself, for, as she wrote to me, she quite lost her heart to half a dozen of them. "How much nicer they are," she said, "and how much more they know than those who profess to teach them. I believe it has been lately maintained that it is the young and fair who are the truly old and truly experienced, inasmuch as it is they who alone have a living memory to guide them. The whole charm, it has been said, of youth lies in its advantage over age in respect of experience, and when this has for some reason failed or been misapplied, the charm is broken. When we say that we are getting old, we should say rather that we are getting new or young, and are suffering from inexperience, trying to do things which we have never done before, and failing worse and worse, till in the end we are landed in the utter impotence of death. Miss Pontifex died many a long year before the above passage was written, but she had arrived independently at much the same conclusion. She first, therefore, squared the boys. Dr. Skinner was even more easily dealt with. He and Mrs. Skinner called, as a matter of course, as soon as Miss Pontifex was settled. She fooled him to the top of his bent, and obtained the promise of a Ms. copy of one of his minor poems, for Dr. Skinner had the reputation of being quite one of our most facile and elegant minor poets, on the occasion of his first visit. The other masters and masters' wives were not forgotten. Alethea laid herself out to please, as indeed she did wherever she went, and if any woman lays herself out to do this, she generally succeeds.